Hey guys, how's it going? I'm back here with another video, and today this is the 5th episode of the series where I teach you guys GraphQL from the beginning. And in the previous episodes, we built out at least the beginning of our GraphQL API. You can see that we basically defined a schema that looks pretty nice. We have two types of users, or two types in our application. One is called type user, and the other is called type movie. And we also have our type query, which allows us to query users and movies. So this basically taught you guys a lot. It taught how to use arguments while defining queries. I also taught how to create an enum, which was something that I wanted to show because I don't know. I just thought it would be interesting to show in this tutorial. And then we also went over how to build resolvers for those functions. We're currently using this fake data list over here, which just contains a list of users for the user list. And there's also a movie list. And the resolvers basically just use that list to deal with the data, right? Depending on what they want to return. And we also have a resolver for the favorite movies field inside of user, which if you don't remember from the last episode, is important because favorite movies is a field inside of user which doesn't return like a basic type already existent in GraphQL. It returns a movie, which is a type we created. So we do need to specify how to get the favorite movies for this user, since in our fake data over here, this isn't included inside of the user list. So in the user that the data for the user that we get from our single database request, it doesn't include a field called favorite movies. So we do need to do that over here at the bottom when we inside of our resolver. So in this video, what we're gonna go over is basically how to work with mutations, which is the other root type that exists inside of GraphQL, similar to query. But as I explained in the first episode, a mutation, it differs from a query because it is basically used to mutate the data, to alter the data. So if you were using HTTP methods, a query would be like a GET request, and a mutation would be like a put, a post, or a delete request. It is used both like for creating data, for updating data, and for deleting data. Now we're still using fake data for this tutorial. So what I'm going to do is, if I want to add a user, for example, to our to our data, I'm just going to push a new object inside of this user list array, and that's how we're going to add stuff into our data, right? And the similar thing will be done with the other types. Like, I'm going to show you guys an example of updating and deleting, just to show you guys how you can do that. And yeah, that's basically it. Before we get into the tutorial, if you guys could leave a like and subscribe, I would massively appreciate it. This tutorial series is actually getting a lot less views than I expected, but it's totally fine because I'm loving this. I love teaching like more complicated topics, and I feel like the reason why it's not getting a lot of views is because it's not a beginner video. So it makes sense that not a lot of people would see it, and it's probably one of the most worst performing series in my channel, but it's totally fine because I'm loving it. So don't worry. I saw some people commenting like, "Don't stop the series." I won't stop the series until I feel like it's a good point for it to end. And yeah, if you enjoyed the series, please leave a like because it will help a lot the channel. So now let's get into the tutorial. Okay everyone, so to start writing mutations into our project, the first thing we gotta do is, similar to a query, every GraphQL schema that wants to alter data, wants to add data, should have a type called mutation. So I'm gonna come over here and I'm just gonna add the type called mutation. And similar to query, what you do over here is you just write the name of the fields that are going to be able to mutate stuff. So for example, if I want to have a field which creates a user, I might just create a field over here called create user, something like this, right? And obviously, similar to like other types in GraphQL, you need to point out that it returns something. So what is commonly like the standard in GraphQL is whenever you create something or you delete or you update something, whenever you have a mutation with some sort of type, you just return the type. So if I'm going to create a user, I do all the logic to add the user to my database, or in this case, just to my fake data file over here. And at the end, I just return back the user for the following reason. GraphQL deals a lot with caching, so you need to update the data in the front end so that it is in the most updated state possible. And we'll go over this more in the next tutorials. But for now, let's just imagine that whenever we run a mutation, we've got to return its new updated values. So with the create user, it's something that we want to do. It's basically a mutation that will allow us to add a new user to our user list that we created. Now, one thing that we need to take into account is how do we know the data that we're sending? You can see that each user requires an ID, a name, a username, an age, a nationality. It doesn't require friends, but you can see that those are the ones required, and you can add those as well over here. So how do we allow the user to, whenever they make this mutation, they send the data required to form a user? Well, it's pretty similar to how you pass IDs and arguments for queries. However, the difference here is that it is a lot of data. So it would be kind of boring to just come over here and just add stuff like, oh, a name, which is a string, and age, which is an int. This would make this huge, right? And you can do this if you want, especially if it isn't a lot of arguments. But for creating a user, you pretty much need to put a name, a username, an age, and a nationality. So a common thing you can do is, instead of defining stuff like this, you can actually just come over here and say that create user accepts a user of type user. And then kind of makes sense, and you can make this required. But one thing I want to propose is that whenever you create mutations and you want to put arguments for mutations or anything that is big, I would use something in GraphQL called an input, which basically allows you to just define inputs for arguments whenever you have a field. So for example, we have this create user over here. Why don't I just come over here and say input create user input. Just open and close curly braces like this, and then we can specify which fields we want to use to create a user. Now, I understand that this might seem like it's redundant because literally what we're doing over here is we're just gonna copy and paste this over here, and the only thing we're not gonna add for the input is the ID, because obviously it's not, you shouldn't be passing an ID. You shouldn't need to know the ID whenever you create a user. But the thing is, there's many practical reasons why you need to use an input instead of just directly putting the type as the argument over here. And I'm gonna just change this before I explain to you guys. But basically, there's a lot of stuff that you can use and do with an input that you can't do with the type. For example, imagine that this age variable over here wasn't required. It was just you just accept an integer, right? Imagine that since it's not required, I cannot pass, I'm allowed to not pass an age, and this input would be completely correct. I would be able to create a user. Now, what happens if I want to say something like, this shouldn't be required, the user don't need to send an age, but if they don't send an age, I want it to default to 18 years old. So if I want to do that, I can't do that with the type because that doesn't make sense. This is just the structure of the user. Whilst over here, if I want to do something like that, I can just say something like this is equal to 18, and this over here should default to 18 if age is not passed. This is a little trick that works with GraphQL. Now in our case, we want to make age be required, and it also points out that you don't need to pass an ID, which is important, and that's why you should be creating an input like this. So now we're just gonna put this over here. We already did as an input, and we're gonna make it required because you should pass an input to create a user. Now, how do we deal with this? How do we go from this field being a mutation to actually creating and adding our new data into our table, or in our case, our fake data array? Well, you can see that if I refresh my code over here, this is my API. It does give me an error, which is kind of weird. Let me go over here to my code. It's saying that, oh, I got an error, which is just saying that the type of create user input.friends must be an input type but got user. This makes total sense, and it was a tricky mistake. Over here, you can see that we do have a friends field, right? we do have this thing inside of our user called friends. But the thing is, inside of our input, we're saying that if you want to add friends, you just have to pass a type user. But that doesn't make any sense because we're just creating a user, right? So what I want to propose is when you create a user, you don't pass a movie or friends. We're going to do this separately. So when you create a user, all you need to pass is your name, your username, your age, and your nationality, which are the like the required types and that we created over here. And by the way, since I didn't specify, since nationality is like not a specific type, it's an enum that we created. I do want to be able to allow it to not be passed, to not be required. And the reason for that is because when you're working with predefined types that are like this, you need to account for the fact that maybe someone or for some reason passes Canada but without like capital letters like this. And if we make this required, completely required, it will give us an error if it isn't the correct, like exactly how we define over here, which is something we might want to avoid. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say the nationality is a nationality. It's not required. But if no one passes a nationality, let's default it to Brazil. And yeah, I'm just choosing Brazil because I'm from Brazil. But yeah, this is just an example because I find this really cool, and I just wanted to show you guys how this would work in a real application. So our user input now is correct. Let's check. You can see no errors are occurring. Let me refresh over here. You should see that if I just remove this over here, I'm actually just going to remove this. I'm going to remove the get movie as well from the last episode. We still have our query over here, and it's working perfectly. If we want to run a mutation, we really can't do anything about it. And the reason why we can't just run a mutation right now is because we created the mutation type over here, create user, but we didn't actually write any resolvers that actually do something about it, that actually gets this input and creates a user. So to do that, let's come to our resolver.js over here. And similar to how we have a query type inside of our resolvers, and we have all the resolvers for the fields for the query, and we also have a user type over here for the user. We want to have a mutation type inside of here. So I'm gonna put it right below the. Actually, I'll put it below the user, like down over here, and I'm just gonna call this mutation, and it's gonna be an object, which is just gonna include like all of the functions related to mutating the data. So the first function that we're going to work with is the one that we created. It has to be the same name. So it has to be called create user. And we're going to come over here, just create the function, and it should be fine. Now, one of the things is when you create a user or when you write any mutation, you'll probably need to like access some sort of argument to the function. So similar to how we accessed like the arguments for the fields that we're requiring, the required arguments, we're going to do the same thing. We need to get these two things over here from our function, and now we can use this args to be the new user. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to say const user is equal to args.input, like this, input, because if you recall, we created over here the argument is called input, like it has a type input, and this includes everything that we want to use. So in order to access this, I can say args.input, and now I get the user info that exists inside of here. So now just to see if it's working or not, let's just console log this like this, and just console log the user. It will give us an error, definitely, because we're not returning a user like we said we would. One thing is I'll not make this required. I'll just make this not required for now. And let's come over here and let's try to run this mutation to see if everything is working. So in order to run a mutation, you do something very similar to a query. You come over here to where you're going to make the API request. You're just going to run mutation. Then we just open and close curly braces, which is a bit different from a query because we were using the name over here. We could still give a name for this. So I can just come over here and say something like create user as the name of the mutation. And then inside of here, I tell which of the fields inside of the mutation type we're trying to access. In our case, we just have one field, which is called create user. So I can just say create user over here. And you should see that it will, because we're using the Apollo GraphQL Studio, it will automatically generate some of the stuff for us. So you can see like it generated this parentheses over here and all of this information inside. I'll just explain really quickly what they mean. So when you define a mutation like this and you give it a name, like create user, you first grab the variable, like you create a variable by using this money sign over here and set it equal to be of the type create user input. And that means that now we can pass the input data over here, similar to how when you're going to make the request in the front end, you're going to pass the data as a variable to the mutation. Then inside of here, we just say that we call the mutation and we just set the input to be equal to the variable that we created. I know this is kind of confusing, and believe me, it's going to make a lot more sense when we start working in the front end. But for now, just go with the flow. We're just going to pass the data inside of this variable, and it should be accessible inside of our resolver. So for now, let's just write something like I want to get an ID, I want to get the name, and I want to get the age. And the data I'm going to pass, it has to be of a user type or a create user input, which just asks us to have name. So let's just pass a name like this, name. I'll just make it Pedro. Then let's pass age. So I'll just pass age, which would be 20. Oh, by the way, this has to be JSON, so we do need to double quotes this. And let me just open this up a bit. The final one, it's actually not the final one. I think it's username. So username even comes before. So I'm just gonna say username like this, and I'm gonna pass PedroTech. And then finally, we're gonna have nationality, which technically we don't need to pass. So actually, I won't pass just to see if it defaults to Brazil. Now, when I click create user, you see it gives us no. It did work. Status 200. It did work because although we didn't return a user, because in our resolver we're currently not returning a user, we should see the data that we passed over here being console logged in our server. And as you can see, this is exactly what happens, and it actually defaults the nationality to Brazil because although we didn't pass any value for it. So we know that it's working. We know that we can access the user by saying args.input, which is amazing. So now all we had to do is just add this new user to our fake data array over here. Or if in your case you're using any database like MySQL or MongoDB, here's where you add a new field to your database table. So for us, what we're gonna do is we're just gonna come over here. We're gonna grab the ID of the last user. This is something we have to do because we want to increment the ID by 1 every single time. So I'm just gonna say const last ID like this is equal to user list, and I'm gonna grab the last one. So I'm just gonna say I want to grab the user list dot length like this -1. So I'm just grabbing the last element and I want to grab the ID from it. And this is the last ID. So what I want to do is I want to add to this user type that we just grabbed from the input. I want to say user.id. I want to add a new ID to it and set it equal to last ID plus 1. Because now if the last ID was 5, now the new user we add is going to have an ID of 6, if that makes any sense. And then finally, I think this is all we need, because now all we have to do is we just have to say user list dot push, and we're gonna add the new user to the list, and at the end we just return this user. Now let's see if this is working. If this is working, what should happen is you can see over here, if I query all the users, like over here, I'm just gonna also remove this, you should see that there's no PedroTech over here. Oh no, I'm getting all the movies, not users. I need to grab all the users. So I'll just say get all users, and let's just query the users field over here. And I'm just gonna delete all of this because this was the previous query. And what I really want to do is inside of here I want to grab the ID, I want to grab the name, and I want to grab the age just for now. You can see that all the users, none of them, just one of them is called Pedro. So what I'm going to do is I want to add a new user. The name is not going to be Pedro. The name is going to be Elliot. And the username is going to be Elliot123. The age can be 20 as well. And I won't pass a nationality again. So what we're going to do is we're going to just uncomment the mutation. and let's run this mutation again to see what happens. You can see, first of all, we do get the user back because we're now returning the user at the end of the mutation. And let's uncomment this, and let's run the get all users again to see if the data was actually updated. And you can see that it was. We now have an Elliot, and the ID is 6, and the age is 20, which means we are actually adding some data to our table. Now, we're just doing this very simply by just pushing it into array. And if you're using a database, it should be a little bit more complicated, but at the same time, just put the logic for like inserting into a database table right over here. Instead of having to do like all of this thing over here. This is just because I'm using fake data. And yeah, I hope you guys got this. And this is going to be the flow of creating mutations from now on. Now, since we went over our first mutation, I just want to go a little bit faster for the next ones that we're going to create, because it's going to be pretty much the same. So for example, we have a create user. Let's just add a update user, right? Because it might be something that we want to do. Let's instead of being update user, because should we do update user? Actually, let's not do update user. Let's just do update username, something like this. So we just want to get a new username and update that user, that user's username. So to do that, what we got to do is we got to create a new input over here, and this input is going to be pretty simple. We're going to call it update user input, or update username input, like this. And what it requires is, number one, an ID, like this, because we want to get the ID of the user. We want to update the username. And then it also requires the new username. So let's just write here, new username, like this. And it's going to be a string. And what we do is we just put input as a field, and we say that it is of type update username input. And at the end, we should return a user, like this. Now we just create the resolver for it. The resolver is going to be pretty simple again. We're going to just copy and paste this over here. What I want to do is I'm just going to grab the ID for the user. I'm going to delete this over here, and I just want to grab the ID of the user we want to update by saying args.input.id. And then I also want to grab the new username by saying new username is equal to args.input.new username. We could actually have done this a lot easier. We could have just done something like this. Set it equal to args.inputs, and then just grabbing the ID and the username by destructuring the object. This is a little trick that I would recommend for you guys. Instead of having to write new lines, do everything in one of them. And now we have access to the ID and the new username that is going to be passed in the argument. So what do we do with it? Well, the first thing we want to do is we want to, first of all, find the user with this ID and just change its username. So to make that, I'm actually going to do it pretty simply. I'm just going to grab the user list. I'm then going to for each like loop through the username or the user list, and I'm going to grab each user over here, and all I'm going to do is I'm just going to ask if user.id is equal to the ID that we want to update. Then I want to say that the user.username is equal to the new username, like this. And this should be fine. We're just looping through the user list, checking to see if any of the elements in the user list has an ID equal to the one that we want to update. And if it is, then we want to update the username to the new one passed in the arguments. And at the end, after everything is done, I want to do this right here. I want to create a variable called user, and it can be null, right? We'll initialize it like this. And if we eventually find a user and actually that we want to update, then we'll just set this user equal to user, or actually I'll just call this user with change. Actually, I'll just call it user updated. It makes more sense. And I'll set this equal to the user that was actually found and that has the username updated. And then at the end, we just return the user updated. Now, there's no guarantee that we're going to pass in the front end an ID that actually exists in our table or in our data. So this over here can be null, which makes sense because we just made our return type to be not required, which means that we don't really need to send something back, as long as like this allows us to handle errors more easily. So let's test to see if this is working. Let's come over here to our Apollo GraphQL Studio. Let's get all users. You see everyone is working perfectly. You can see Elliot disappeared because we restarted the server, so that's right. But one thing I want to do is I want to update the Sarah's username. Let's just grab username over here. Let's see what is Sarah's username. It is currently Cameron. I want to update it. So to do that, I'm just gonna call a mutation over here. I'm gonna just copy and paste it like this. But instead of create user, I'm gonna call it update username. And instead of being the create user, I'll just say update username. Oh damn, I just realized this got pretty confusing. So I'll just delete this. I'll say mutation, update user, like this. And then I'm just gonna say update username as a field, and you can see it filled in everything perfectly. Now we specify which fields we want to get from the user who was updated. I'll just grab the ID. I want to get the username, which are the two fields that actually matter. So if I come over here and I just remove the create user input, and instead I put an input for the update user, I need to pass an ID. The ID for Sarah is 3, so I'll just pass 3 over here. Then the username for Sarah is Cameron, so we want to update that to, let's make her username, I don't know, Ward, like this. So this is the data we're passing. Let's try to run it. It actually didn't work because it said that the field new username required, oh, I called it new username, not username. So I need to say new username, like this. And now that we have the correct name for this variable over here, let me just click on update username, and it doesn't seem to work, which is kind of weird. Let me just take a look at the code. I don't see anything. Oh, actually, damn, I already found the error. So we just copy and pasted the create user mutation function and forgot to change this to update username. So this needs to be the same name as the name we had for our type definitions. So now that this is done, if I run this, you should see that we get back the data. And if I actually come over here and I try to get all users again, you should see that Sarah now has a username Ward instead of whatever the username was before. If I want to update Pedro's username to PedroTech, I can just come over here, uncomment the mutation again, and pass Pedro's like ID as 2, and then I'll just come over here, change this to, I don't know, Pedro 123, and when I click update user, we should see that it sends back the correct data. And if we query all users again, it should show that both Pedro and Sarah has updated usernames, which means it's working, which is awesome. And we basically are able now to update stuff inside of our data. Finally, to keep the episode short, I'm just going to really quickly show you guys delete mutation, which is going to be pretty simple. The first thing I want to do is just delete all of this because it's kind of annoying me that we have a lot of stuff inside of our operations, like little tab over here. Then I want to come over here and I just want to add a new field to our mutation. Let's call it delete user, and or I'll just say that it will return a user, the user that was deleted. But one thing I want to point out is that when you want to delete a user, usually you just have to pass an ID, right? It kind of makes sense. You just want to pass an ID and delete the user with that ID. So I'm just going to grab an ID. I don't even care to create an input because in this case, it's just one field. So it doesn't really matter. We don't need to create an input type just for this. So now to finally delete stuff, I'll just come over here to our resolvers, add a delete resolver by saying delete user and just adding the function. We do need to grab the parent again because we need to get the args. Because now if I need to get the ID from this args by saying const ID equal to args.id. Then now that we have the ID, in order to remove a user with in a list, in an array with that specific ID, we can just use the lodash function called remove. So we can do something like this. Just come over here, say dot remove, then say that we want to remove it from the user list, and then it will loop to the user list, and we'll just say that we only want to remove the users which the user.id is equal to the ID of the user we want to remove. In our case, and as we did before, like the ID will come as a string, so we do need to convert it into a number by just saying number ID, like this. And this should remove everything. Since we're not keeping track of the user, and for simplicity reasons, I'll just return no right here. We don't really care that much about the user that was deleted, and that's kind of most cases this happens. But since we just return everything, it seems that we removed it from our array. Let's test it out. How do we get this to work? Well, what we can do is we can just come over here and say mutation. And for this one, just to show you guys, you don't actually need to write the name of the mutation or query. You don't need to give this name. This is more best practices, and it's easier for organization, especially when you're working in the front end. But what we can do is we can just say mutation, then write delete user, and it will actually generate a mutation without a name, as you can see over here. We do say that we want to get the field called delete user, and that we need to pass an ID. So I'm just going to delete the old inputs that we had over here for variables, and just leave the delete user ID. And I want to delete the user with the ID 4, Rave. I want to delete Rave over here. So I'll just pass 4. And for the user that returns back, right now we're returning null, so I'll just put ID over here just for it, or else it will give you an error. And let's try running this. If I click run, you should see null because we are returning null. And if I try to run the get all users, which by the way, if you want to alternate between stuff that you wrote in your operations tab over here, you don't really need to comment them out. I can't believe I actually just found out. It's because the Apollo GraphQL Studio is actually pretty new, so I'm still pretty new to it. So I just found out that you just need to click like this, and it will keep like alternating between whatever operations you want to make. So we just deleted the user. Let's try to get all users again, and you should see that Rave is not here because we deleted. If I try deleting Kelly over here, you should see that Kelly doesn't exist anymore. So this is amazing. It means our mutations are working. It means that our GraphQL API is pretty much like in a pretty good state, right? We have some cool queries. We have some cool mutations. We have some complicated types. We talked a lot about inputs. We talked a lot about different types that you need and how to build your resolvers like this. And yeah, I'm really excited for how the state of the series is. If you have any questions, just leave them down below because I'm answering every single question, and I really like to help, especially regarding GraphQL. So if you liked the video, please leave a like down below and comment what you want to see next. Subscribe because I'm posting 3 to 4 times a week, and I would massively appreciate it. And yeah, that's basically it. Really hope you guys enjoyed it, and I see you guys next time.